Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, June 20th, and we will hear the power of parcel data, leveraging land ownership information and water insights for smarter planning. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box. I'll do my best to answer those technical questions. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation during our designated Q&A. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2025. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by a joint initiative between the APA Water and Planning Network and the APA ENRI division, which is, let's see,
Environmental, Resources, and Energy.
And Energy. Thank you. So we are thankful for both of you for joining today. And this is sort of part of a series, I guess, that the Water and Planning Network and ENRI have done jointly. So we're so happy to have you here today. And let's see, next up on your screen. So these are our two sessions that we are going to have in July. July is a little bit slower just because we know everyone is doing the July thing. So we have two sessions for you to register for. We are booking into the fall, and those will become available on our website here shortly. I can't believe we're talking about the fall already. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session, for those needing your AICP CM credits, the session is worth 1.5 CM credits and one of the mandatory sustainability and resilience credits. You can log them by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account. From there, you can search by today's title or event number to log those credits. And that information can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a weekly reminder of what's on tap. We record all of our sessions. We post them to our YouTube channel. So just type in youtube.com/planningwebcast will pop up, along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get notification when a new session recording has been uploaded and is available for you to view. Last thing, new this year, we have a mailing list. So take a snapshot of that QR code, or again, head over to our website, link on the bottom of the screen, and you can subscribe. I promise I send out exactly one email a month at the top of each month, and it's just a reminder of the sessions that are available for you to register for, and any on-demand sessions that we have. We always have on-demand sessions available if you need those CM credits, particularly for those important required sessions, the law, the ethics, the equity, and the SNR. So head over to our website for all that info. You can subscribe also there. So that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions for our panelists, type them in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end. Don't raise your hand because I'm not going to call on you. Just type your questions or your comments in the Q&A box. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Marianne to kick us off.
Okay, well, I have the pleasure of introducing this topic. My name is Marianne Dickinson. I am the co-chair of the American Planning Association's Water and Planning Network. I hope a lot of you who are attending are already members of our network, as we've been promoting this webinar pretty heavily. But just for those of you who are not familiar with who we are, we just wanted to say a few words about the Water and Planning Network. We're a free network of water and land use professionals. And we created this through the American Planning Association, but you don't need to be an APA member to join. And the reason is we wanted water folks who typically are members of other water organizations and not APA to be able to interact with the planners who are typically thinking about a lot of these land use issues. At this point, we've got over 500 people who are members, network members. There's a mailing list you sign up for, and we send out notices of webinars and news as we hear it on water and land use topics. So the newsletters come out every other month or so, and we usually do 3 to 4 webinars a year with CM credits through Christine. So thank you, Christine, for the work you do for us. We also have in-person meetings when APA is in town. So at the last National Planning Conference in Denver, we had a meeting of the Water and Planning Network. And we also promote publications on water and planning issues. You see here a photo of the APA publication Planners in Water, which my other co-chair, Bill Sesnick, is an author on. So that's a must read for those who are concerned about how to better integrate land and water use together. And so there's a link to that report. So in the next slide, just finish up a little bit about the network. In order to join it, you just email me at water@planning.org, and I will happily add you to our mailing list. And I promise it's not an invasive list. We don't email too much, as Christine says, probably once or a month or maybe twice. We also have a LinkedIn page, and we're on X for what that's worth. And so that's where you can get in touch with us. And one of the fun things that I get to do in this position is to invite wonderful folks to come and talk about how their work is going to better integrate water and land use planning. And so at this point, I'm going to be happy to introduce our 2 speakers today, Jeff Allenby and JP Miller. Jeff is the Director of Geospatial Innovations at the Center for Geospatial Solutions, or CGS, where he leads the development of cutting-edge tools that equip leaders and practitioners with actionable insights to address today's most urgent land, water, and social challenges. A founding member of CGS and the chief architect of Who Owns America, which is the program he'll be talking about today. Jeff's a nationally recognized leader in applying geospatial technology to drive systems level change. He previously served as the director of conservation technology at the Chesapeake Conservancy, where he co-founded the Conservation Innovation Center and has held roles advancing climate adaptation at the University of Maryland and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. With him is JP Miller, who is the Director of Environmental Strategies at CGS, where he leads cross-cutting initiatives at the intersection of environmental markets, land restoration, and water resources to help partners design and implement data-driven solutions. With a deep interdisciplinary background in hydrology, environmental management, urban planning, and geospatial technology, JP drives strategy across client engagement, business development, and technical innovation. He also leads CGS's remote sensing portfolio, applying advanced machine learning techniques to unlike insights from drone and satellite imagery, which sounds fun. So I will turn it over to Jeff and JP to take it away.
Thank you, Marianne. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate you all taking the time today on a Friday to learn a little bit about our work and how we're leveraging GIS and data to help inform planning initiatives across the country, particularly with the intersection with water. The Center for Geospatial Solutions was founded just about 5 years ago as a center of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy with the goal of bridging policy and practice and really bringing the power of technology to bear to be able to advance kind of new methods to be able to integrate technology into decision making across the Lincoln Institute's focus on land, water, and communities. Where the Who Owns America data set and really CGS's work comes from today is the challenge that many policymakers have, where they desperately need data to act and to be able to make informed decisions about what they're working on and what they want to do and what future they want to build. But one of the challenges is that they just have very fragmented and incomplete data sets and access to data. Oftentimes it's spread across government agencies or between state, local, and government agencies, federal agencies, nonprofits. And it takes a lot of time and effort to be able to get everything into one place, to be able to really see how everything works together and to be able to have that full view of what's going on in your community. CGS was founded to really help enable data-driven decisions for the greater good of land, water, and people. And we recognize that a lot of partners had a desire to be able to leverage technology and data within their decision-making, but they didn't necessarily have the capacity in their organizations to be able to do research and development or to do that proof of concept or to figure out kind of all of the minutia of some of these different analyses to be able to leverage it effectively. And so we really saw an opening and an opportunity for us to be that role and to help spread kind of our knowledge after we develop it across partners, to really be able to not have to do all of that back end work, but to be able to take advantage of access to technology. CGS's team in the last 5 years has grown to be over 25 people. We're remote and we're spread across the country, which really gives us a variety of benefits, both in terms of, being able to access the greatest talent regardless of where they are, but also brings in a really big diversity of perspectives and experience. So we have partners who are entrenched in the Southwest with, water issues in the Colorado River, have deep experience knowing that, JP and myself are both in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and kind of know a lot of what's going on in the Mid-Atlantic. We have partners up in New England. We have partners out in Colorado in the Mountain West, out in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. And really what we're able to do is bring together expertise from a variety of different fields and experience in working with partners on the front lines in a lot of different scenarios, that when we combine it together just gives us a really comprehensive view of what challenges our partners are facing, what technology is out there, and how we can bring it all together under a single kind of unified front to be able to apply it in a variety of situations. What that also allows us to do is to see where there's commonalities. A lot of people think Colorado River and Chesapeake Bay are two very different things in terms of water and planning. Chesapeake Bay might be more nutrients and water quality, Colorado River is more water quantity. Fundamentally, though, it's a lot of the same stuff that people are focusing on. Understanding where water is, how it's being used, where it's going, being able to track all of those pieces effectively. As we build out new data solutions for the public good, we're really focusing on kind of 3 different sections. And I wouldn't say there's just 3 different categories, but really a spectrum, and they all blend into each other. The first is what we're looking at is really on data modernization. This is looking at best practices for data management, data storage, and data collection. A lot of partners are working with legacy systems that may have been built 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago and have been added on to over the years, but really fundamentally are built to collect data in a very static fashion to be used for one purpose, and are good for that purpose, but not necessarily blending and working with other data sets and working on modern infrastructure. So a lot of our work, and some of what you'll hear about today, is working with partners to say, okay, how do we bring your legacy system to modern standards, which opens up a lot more possibilities for what we can do with the information and how we can combine it with other things, which blends into the second point, which is data fusion. This is the perspective that, as everyone on this call knows, planning is very nuanced and takes into account a lot of different perspectives. And so with that, what we need to do is be able to take data from a variety of different sources and talking about a variety of different aspects around the environment and the community that we live in, and bring them together to be able to see how they interact, how they overlap, how they influence each other. This again requires some skill in being able to take data, ideally in a modern framework, and combine it and run that analysis. But once you have that information combined, what we can do is really work on the third aspect, which is visualization and use. Again, we work with a variety of partners from very, very deep technical skills with large GIS teams on their own capacity to all volunteer organizations with 0 GIS capacity. And so what we literally work on is developing tools that allow a variety of people with a variety of technical capacity to be able to access this information and be able to translate information into actionable insights about where in the land they should be working, what they should be doing, and really being able to focus their time and effort where it's going to have the biggest impact. So that's a little bit of background on CGS. I'm going to hand it over to JP to talk about our first example, but just giving you an idea of the agenda for today, we're going to talk about a very specific example out in Pinal County, Arizona. Then I'll take it back and talk a little bit about our Who Owns America data, which is really operating more at a national scale. JP will follow up with talking about our water data discovery tools and a system called GeoConnects. And then I'll wrap it up a little bit at the end with what's next and what's coming next. So with that, I'll hand it over to JP.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. To ground this in kind of a real world example, I want to take us to Pinal County, Arizona, which is a place where questions about land ownership and water availability collide really head on. Pinole really sits at the front lines of growth in groundwater management, and the work we've done there shows how integrating Parcel and water data can empower smarter planning and more responsive planning. So just, kind of brief history of Arizona groundwater that's relevant here. The story of groundwater regulation in Arizona actually started really with an investigative reporter at the Arizona Republic. They uncovered a massive land swindle that was tied to organized crime, essentially selling land to us East Coasters with no associated water. Tragically, that reporter was actually killed by that organized crime unit. And that actually shook the nation, and it also triggered a statewide reckoning, really, about how Arizona managed land and water. That eventually led to the 1980s Groundwater Management Code, which was signed by Governor Bruce Babbitt. And that was really designed to kind of curb groundwater overuse, particularly in some of the fast-growing regions of the state. And one of the major provisions of that was that new groundwater uses were restricted, but a lot of the existing ones were grandfathered in. In 1995, Arizona took it a step further with something called the Assured Water Supply Program, or AWS program, which I'm going to talk about a lot more. And that requires developers to prove that they have 100 years of renewable water before they could sell, for instance, subdivision lots. And this program created kind of some tools for recharge and recovery for these groundwater areas and to allow for more long-term planning and reuse. But in 2019, Pinole really and Arizona came back to the national attention. There was a revised groundwater model for this Pinole County, what's called an active management area, that frankly showed a really stark reality. Water demand had far exceeded supply. The model revealed that there was an unmet demand of about 8 million acre feet. So to put that in context, that's essentially equivalent to covering the entire state of Massachusetts in a foot of water, right? So a very large amount of water that we're talking about. And about a quarter of that, so about 2 million acre feet, was associated with unmet demand for this assured water supply program, which was really concerning because this was supposed to be a net balance. And that's why the program was enacted in the first place. So after the release of that revised groundwater model, the story really made national headlines, right? Headlines across NPR, CNN, Los Angeles Times, and others really highlighted this idea that Arizona was growing without water. Communities were betting against an uncertain future, or worse, building in areas with no water. And to be fair, some of that concern is real. Growth pressure is high. The Southwest is in a long-term drought, and there are examples of poor planning. But some of this coverage is also a bit sensational. Not every part of Arizona is running dry. And in fact, the real story is a lot more nuanced than what you're seeing in the headlines here. And that's where the kind of granular parcel level data that we're working with really becomes essential. To plan well, you need to know exactly where the water is, who owns the land, how much water is being actually used, and what is legally allowed. These headlines might get people's attention, but data is what helps planners respond responsibly and proactively. Next slide. So let's zoom out for a second and orient ourselves. So Pinole County, for those who are not familiar, is between Phoenix and Tucson. It's part of Arizona's kind of urbanizing corridor. It's still heavily agriculture, but there's a lot of residential development occurring. There's also a lot of kind of industrial and manufacturing growth occurring. Think electric vehicles, semiconductor, fabrication, data centers, things of that nature. This map on the right shows a couple of Arizona's active management areas that I mentioned before, or AMAs. And these are regions where the state regulates groundwater kind of more aggressively, as I mentioned. And Pinole is one of those 5 AMAs, and it really has a lot of its own distinct challenges and rules, but these are commonly shared also across some of the other groundwater basins. So on the left, you can see a breakdown of water demand in Pinole. And it's pretty striking. About 80% of the demand comes from non-tribal agriculture. Municipal and industrial use are honestly pretty small by comparison. On the right side, you can see the water supply picture, and it's really not balanced. Basically, about half of supply comes from groundwater, and another 40-ish% or so essentially comes from the Central Arizona project via the Colorado River. It's delivered via a canal, and so we also have a little bit of regional surface water and reclaimed water, but that's like less than 10% of the overall supply. And so you've got a region that has a lot of different intense competing land use demands on it. It's got limited surface water. It has declining Colorado River allocations and a major reliance on groundwater. Frankly, it's a recipe for tough trade-offs. Slide. So with all that complexity that I just went over, CGS, the Center for Geospatial Solutions, was brought in to really help make sense of this picture. We worked with Arizona Water Company, state agencies, and a lot of local stakeholders to understand what was really happening, parcel by parcel across all of this data. It's a huge undertaking. And what we found was no one really had a complete picture. So we sketched out what it would take to build that. And that's really how the idea for this kind of Pinal County Water Data Hub came about. What would it take to have a shared workspace where everyone can see the same reality? And to do that, we identified some of the kind of core requirements we thought that were necessary. So the first was really having this parcel level data as a foundational unit. We needed a shared collaboration environment with kind of clear permissions for different users, the ability to link land use and ownership to water use and legal status. We needed repeatable workflows across organizations with accurate metadata, some versioning, some visual tools to make that data actually actionable. And finally, everything had to be credible and transparent enough to inform actual policy decisions. This wasn't just about building a dashboard. It was about building trust and alignment across diverse parties who needed a shared understanding to be able to act. Next slide. So to get that accurate picture of what was really happening on the ground, we really had to build the system from the bottom up, which was a lot of work. And that started with kind of the most granular and sensitive data. So at the base of this triangle, we're working at the parcel and water meter level, literally tracking who owns what land and how much water they're actually using. From there, we aggregate up to other geometries, dimensions. So things like subdivisions or areas with a certificate of assured water supply. These are essentially neighborhood scale footprints where developers have to demonstrate their ability to meet that 100-year water supply. And this is really a lot of the scale where housing policy meets that water planning. And finally, we move up to the utility subregions. These are kind of areas managed by different providers across the county, where infrastructure planning, a variety of investments, and regulatory decisions play out. But really, we realized to have accurate and actionable picture of what's happening on the ground, we needed to have unified data, and we needed to start at a granular level for that, because we needed this to be grounded in real defensible data. So it was a pretty significant undertaking for us. Next slide. So all this work wasn't just an academic exercise. It's directly informing real-world decision-making today. The insights we generated are now being used to guide policy, support permitting decisions, and help shape the future of development pathways in Pinal County, all with a clearer understanding of how land and water actually interact. Next slide. So here's how it all came together on the ground. We worked with a range of partners. The Arizona Water Company is the utility, the city of Casa Grande, Pinal County, the Arizona Department of Water Resources, Maricopa Association of Governments, and each of these partners had to bring a critical piece of the puzzle together. And it's really hard to work across those different data silos And so this was a huge challenge for us to try to get this in one place. From the Arizona Water Company, we got granular data on metered water use and kind of the service subregion boundaries. Pinal County and the city of Casa Grande provided detailed data on parcels and permit information, which was really difficult to work with. And from the state, we pulled in their certificate of assured water supply data. So kind of the boundaries where water commitments are tied to development. And Maricopa Association of Government contributed population and dwelling unit projections, kind of helping us think ahead about what does the future look like. And when we stitched all of this together, it gave us a real-time picture of what's actually happening in the area. How much water is being used within each assured water supply footprint? How many homes are there now? When were they built? Under what regulatory regime were they built, right? Are they grandfathered in? Are they not? Do the new rules apply? As well as, where is new housing, new development likely to occur? And that kind of integrated view allows planners, utilities, and developers to make smart, legally defensible decisions about where and how growth can happen. Next slide. So this work is already having a policy impact. The Arizona Water Company is now pursuing what's called an alternative designation of assured water supply, an ADOS, which allows them to use real-world data, not just projections, to justify long-term development. And this will be the first one that has been issued in the state. Thanks to our analysis, they were able to show that across the region, water use in these assured water supply areas is only about a third of what was originally granted and entitled. So this is a big deal because, if we connect this back to that 2019 groundwater model that we discussed earlier, that showed that 2 million acre-foot shortfall tied to the assured water supply program, that rested on the assumption that all of those certificates were using their full allotment of water. But we know that they're actually only using a third, right? So it's a huge difference. Our data shows, basically, we can add a significant amount of water back into the system. It doesn't necessarily erase all the shortfall entirely, but it does reshape the conversation. And it also highlights how local water conservation policies have been working, right? We're using way less water than people expected, especially when developers were putting these in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. And this is really the difference between planning with assumptions and planning with actual parcel level and granular data. So lastly, this is kind of the map where it all comes together. So we've combined parcel level water usage, these assured water supply footprints, current and planned infrastructure, and projections of future residential development through 2024 or 2040, sorry. The shaded regions kind of show residential unit growth, and you can see how that aligns, or in some cases doesn't align, with available infrastructure and assured water supplies. And really what's powerful here isn't that this is a single map with a single snapshot in time. It's that it's a living data set built up from the ground using actual conditions, right? And now utilities, local governments, and the state can use this to guide investments, approve permits, and really shape regional planning based on a shared, spatially informed reality. This is what smarter, more responsive water and land planning looks like. Thanks. Back to you, Jeff.
Thanks for that overview, JP. What you just saw was just a really good example of how you can bring data from a variety of different sources in one place together, and hinted at some of the challenges that it takes just to combine data from the permit department with the water utility. A lot of that really requires to have data in a somewhat standardized format, or at least a way to be able to transfer and translate data between systems in a unified way. So that the meter, at this address is tied to the deed and the parcel and the build out and the plat and everything else at that same address. And that required a lot of work to be able to do that. As CGS has worked with a variety of these challenges, as well as things like housing policy, we really saw the opportunity and the need to create a nationally consistent data set around parcel information, and particularly around owner information. This is something that really tied into just a lot of discussions that were going on about everything from the rise of institutional investors in single family homes to water use and consumption out west to, a variety of other planning challenges. Ownership really just has such a strong basis in any decisions that you're making and any policy that comes on top of it to be able to say, is the owner occupied or corporate owned, in state, out of state, all these other pieces. One of the big challenges, though, is that there was no unified national data set that allowed you to really do any sort of analysis at a national scale without doing a lot of work on the back end to be able to get data ready for that. And so we saw an opportunity really for what CGS was created was to be able to say, how do we do some of this research and development, and how do we create some of these products that allow partners on the ground to focus on the policy and the actual implementation of the work and not necessarily focus as much on the data analysis and the data preparation on the back end. Data and parcel information comes from thousands of local sources, about 3,700 county and county equivalent sources across the country. Combining that all into one system is a really big challenge. On top of that, you have things like ownership is hidden by layers of corporate ownership. So, IH borrower for 2017 listed on a deed may not be very meaningful in terms of that ownership, but being able to track that back and say, okay, that's Invitation Homes. These are the types of things that require work and historically have taken a lot of just manual tracking down that makes it really hard for people to incorporate this data in decision making or to be able to use this to be able to say what's actually happening in my neighborhood or my city. There's also no central source for decision making. And so, being able to look at this, even with some of our partners like Salt Lake County, there's 24 municipalities in the county. Everyone's making their own unique decisions about, housing policy or other policies because they're all operating with their own data. And so we really saw a need and an opportunity to be able to create that centralized and unified view, not just across a county, but across the entire country. Who Owns America, the first proof of concept was done a little under 3 years ago. And over the last year in particular, we've spent a lot of time and effort to be able to build our systems to be able to run this analysis across the entire country, about 157 million parcels. And what we do is really reveal the true land ownership, parcel by parcel. This gets into, is this a corporate or a non-corporate, owner that's out of state? How many parcels does that owner own, not just with that frontline LLC, like I mentioned, but tracing it all the way back up to that parent company to really give a very nuanced and informed understanding of ownership across a city or across a county or across a state or across the entire country. It's really about more than land ownership, though. We really view it as the basis of a really powerful analysis engine that allows us to unlock insights across a variety of sectors. This is just a foundational data set that we can look at, ownership trends over time and say, are you seeing an increase in corporate ownership of single family homes? It has that longitudinal nature to it. You could look at things like, recent discussions around protected lands and conservation, across the West and be able to say, where do you have a balance and different aspects to it? You can bring environmental data or water data or any other factor and tie it back to these parcels at a national scale to be able to say, is my county a hotspot of this nationally? Or it may be a hotspot within my region, but it really isn't a hotspot at a national level. It gives you the ability to run these analyses all the way down to the neighborhood level or scale it up all the way to a national level. And that really is a powerful tool for our partners to be able to meet that need at the scale that they're working and be able to have that influence and that nuance. At its core, we really see it providing 4 different kind of main categories of insights. Contextualization is really important just as that baseline setting for any challenge that you're looking at. Who owns what? It's a big challenge, and it really, what we have seen has a lot of nuance even across the city. Like, you can't look at citywide or countywide or statewide statistics around ownership of any category because there's so much nuance that gets down to that neighborhood level. And oftentimes this has a lot of correlation to things like socioeconomics and demographics. And being able to overlay all of that data together is really important to be able to have that context, to be able to understand if I'm implementing a policy, how might this impact different parts of the city differently? And where is it going to have the impact that I want? And potentially, what are some of the unintended consequences that it may have? On the scenario planning side, it's really powerful to be able to look at everything from disaster resilience to flood hazards to looking at, if you're thinking about implementing new rules around accessory dwelling units. How many units may my city be able to support? What does that do in terms of increased population? What demand would that have in terms of, school capacity or road capacity or commuting capacity or public transit or all these different pieces? It really gives you that nuance to be able to go and see, kind of how different implementation of policy is going to have differing impacts based on the ownership trends that you might have there. We're doing a lot of work on site selection right now. Housing is obviously a very big topic nationally, and we've been doing a lot of work mainly in two categories. One is looking at government-owned lands, both from federal, state, and local level, to understand where you may have excess government lands that aren't really being used to its full capacity that could be redeveloped for affordable housing. The other is looking at things like the Yes in God's Backyard movement, which is looking at religious-owned properties and where you have opportunities to convert religious-owned properties into affordable housing. We're also working a lot with JP's team to look at things from environmental mitigation and saying if you're looking at things like wetland restoration or stream restoration or solar suitability or any other aspect to it, you really have the ability to identify the site characteristics of a property across large landscapes to identify the best places for whatever action you're looking at, whether it's affordable housing or solar farms. The last one is monitoring. And like I mentioned, we do have this data set as a baseline that we can track changes over time. This is important both from the perspective of being able to say, is a certain challenge that I'm focusing on getting better or worse over time. We also really see it as the potential to look at helping evaluate the effectiveness of policies that have been put in place. Oftentimes it's a big challenge to be able to say, I put this policy in place, how am I tracking it? Is it number of people who are applying to a program, number of grants going out? But we also have the ability to track at a parcel level, programs to incentivize homeownership having the intended impact that we want? Or is it missing the mark? Or again, is it spatially distributed where certain parts of the city are really taking advantage of these programs, other parts of the city are not? Having the ability to evaluate that at a granular scale. One of the big pieces, and this is similar to kind of what I gave the overview of what CGS works on, is the ability to do these four tasks. The data aggregation really is a big challenge because it's looking at it from the perspective of we're taking data from thousands of different sources and running a lot of algorithms on it on the back end to be able to clean things up, like looking at, consistency of how addresses are written. Street spelled out versus ST can make a really big difference if you're just using kind of a matching algorithm on the background. Things like corp versus corporation can make a big impact on matching those ownership in the portfolio size. And so we've done a lot of work in the back end to be able to have a nationally standardized data set with standardized names, standardized mailing addresses, standardized site addresses that allow us to be able to really do analysis at scale and without having a lot of false positives or false negatives. That's really saves a bunch of time. We've had a lot of partners who said, like, I could do this on my own, but it's a lot easier to just tap into what you've already done versus trying to recreate it. The ownership disambiguation is a really big one as well. It's amazing how many layers of corporate ownership we've seen sometimes on land. I think the deepest we found is about 16 layers deep of holding companies to get back to the ultimate parent corporation. But this is, we're leveraging data from Open Corporates, which is aggregating corporate filings across state and county governments, and really looking at doing that matching, finding branches, finding parent subsidiary relationships to be able to understand the true relationship of ownership that might be missed at just doing that first level cut. This really comes into play in conversations, particularly around things like institutional investors, where there's different definitions that a lot of governments have used to say, what is an institutional investor? You know, is it a portfolio size of 25 units or 100 units or 1,000 units? And if you're only looking at those frontline LLCs that own a company as a portfolio, you're missing a lot, because oftentimes they may only be owning 5 or 10 units within that LLC. But if you look back to that parent company, like Invitation Homes, they own 90,000 single family homes across the United States. And that is a very different view versus the 25 that any individual corporation might own. Looking at the trend analysis is also really big, both in terms of who's buying, selling, or holding land over time, understanding kind of early predictors of gentrification, and where you're starting to see neighborhoods that may be transitioning, both in terms of tax revenue, but also displaced populations that have lived there. Really looking at it from the perspective that all of this is not a static data set. And if it takes you a long time to analyze data and process data in the first place, it makes it that much harder to look at that trend over time. And so really a lot of our processing efficiency at a national scale makes it easier for local partners to be able to access this as a data set trend analysis time. Last one on the data exploration tools is really looking at how do we make sure that partners have the ability to access this in a way that makes sense to them. Some partners want an Excel spreadsheet that just has all of that cleaned up information to run whatever analytics they want. Some want it to be a GIS data set because they're going to run it in data GIS, you know, their desktop GIS application. A lot of partners, though, want it as a web tool because they're not that technical. And we have the ability to build in a lot of kind of data and filtering to be able to create kind of customized scenarios to be able to say, show me properties that are at least half an acre that haven't been sold in 30 years and are owner occupied, you know, and that may be an opportunity to identify properties that might have a transition in ownership in the next 5 to 10 years that have a potential of going from a single family home to a duplex or a quadplex to increase density. You know, getting very defined with those questions, but making it accessible to a variety of partners. Reapplying ownership to the challenge that JP just talked about, you know, in Pinal County, to be able to say, how does water use vary by ownership type? You know, are you seeing those trends over time? How do local policies and ownership patterns influence water demand? You know, this is the slide that JP just showed, but really getting down to that parcel level, we can begin to look and see, you know, as you have some of these neighborhoods that might have high use or low use, how does that translate to individual ownership at that meter level? And begin to look and say, do certain types of owners use more water or less water? Is it the same throughout the year, or is it, you know, kind of flat over the year? And allows you to really get very nuanced to be able to look at different ownership types. This is looking across the city of Casa Grande that JP and his team have been working on, but you see some pretty dramatic trends. So these charts are looking by ownership type over the year. And so you typically see lowest use in January, February. It's not surprising, it's a little bit cooler, you're not watering your lawn, et cetera. But particularly on the owner-occupied and in-state owned properties, you're seeing that summer spike. And this comes from people watering their lawn. This comes from people filling their pools with the amount of evaporation that happens in that 110-degree summer weather. But you definitely see that big spike over time. By color, the lighter colors are earlier, the darker are later, up to 2024. You also do see some pretty dramatic trends as well. I'll show the next slide, will help visualize it a little bit better. Some of the interesting things that I find is particularly the out-of-state non-corporate owned properties. It's a big title. Our understanding of a lot of these properties are their second homes, their vacation homes, where you have people who may be coming in the winter because they want to get away from Colorado or someplace that might be a little bit snowier and want to have that nice, more seasonal winter in their retirement. But you see a pretty flat usage over the year. A lot of that's because they're leaving in the summer and they don't necessarily have those lawns and those pools that have that same water consumption as others. Looking at it from the perspective of trends over the time, you know, you also see some really dramatic differences based on ownership categories. Things like owner-occupied both have the highest use over time, but it's also pretty flat use over the time. And so while it is a slight dip, you're not seeing as much of an impact that may be coming from water efficiency regulations or incentive programs. People are going to do what they're going to do, and they're not going to be swayed too much unless they're told that they have to do that. As a contrast, the blue and red are in-state, non-corporate for blue, and corporate-owned properties. This is all single-family dwellings, by the way. In-state corporate and non-corporate owned properties. The in-state non-corporate, this may be like someone's investment property, as typically smaller portfolios. Similar, less consumption overall, but fairly flat over time. But if you look at that corporate owned, that's the red line, as well as the purple line, which is out-of-state corporate owned, you see a fairly steep drop off in consumption over a 6-year period. This is where the bottom line of paying for water can be higher, and where you may start to see a little bit more of having water efficiency programs taken advantage of, and consumption decreasing over time. With that as a good overview of Who Owns America, I'm going to pass it back to JP to talk about another one of the systems that we're working on called GeoConnects, that's really working on national water data discovery. JP?
Yep. Thanks, Jeff. So, if Who Owns America helps us kind of understand who owns the land, GeoConnects helps us understand what's happening with water, and crucially links that data together across systems and agencies. As part of the Internet of Water Coalition, we've been building out the kind of GeoConnects framework to make water data searchable, interconnected, and useful for planners like you. Water data is everywhere, but it's fragmented, inconsistent, and impossible to stitch together, very similar to parcel data. Asking a simple question like, who's monitoring this river, can yield a bunch of different answers that are hard to reconcile. It's hard to find the data, it's hard to work with the data. And the Internet of Water is a national coalition rethinking how water data flows. At CGS, we serve as the technology steward, leading development of tools, systems, and standards that make this possible. And at the center of this work is something called GeoConnects. Next slide. This may sound hard. It's certainly been challenging, but really weather data largely functions this way. It's as simple to Google. You can just Google the weather for a given location and see what it is. We should be able to do the same thing for water data. Next slide. The key to making this work is really a technology called a knowledge graph, which you don't need to understand yet. But what's important is it's a way of structuring relationships between data points so they're searchable and connected. It's not a new concept. It's how Google understands the world and makes the internet easily searchable. So we could know that Lily is interested in Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. That's located in Paris in a museum, right? It's really about those relationships between them and how they are related. Next slide. Most of you are probably more familiar with relational databases. We don't have to go super deep into detail. A quick analogy for that is Excel shouldn't be a database, but oftentimes it functions like one. And I think most people are familiar at working with Excel, kind of tables in that. A knowledge graph's a bit different. It's really more like a mind map. It's got edges and nodes that are connected to each other with specific relationships. Next slide. And GeoConnects is a knowledge graph for water data, and it works by aligning 3 key elements: shared language, consistent IDs, and a structure that makes data accessible, even to Google. When those are in place, you don't need a custom tool to find water data. You can just search and discover whatever you need. And importantly, GeoConnects is designed as an open, scalable, standards-based system. Anyone can build on it. Next slide. This process started at Duke University, where the Internet of Water Coalition began in 2021, and CGS has been refining and scaling this infrastructure ever since. It's a long process, and it takes a lot of effort and time. And we've been focused on building that strong back end. So if this was a house, we've been doing the framing, the foundation, the electrical, and now we're at the point where we can start thinking about paint color and siding. Next slide. So what does this look like? Let's shift to an example quickly This time kind of focused on water quality, the Maumee River. It feeds into Lake Erie, runs through northwest Ohio, including the city of Toledo. And about a decade ago, harmful algal blooms in the lake got so bad that Toledo had to shut down its drinking water system. That crisis drew national attention and helped launch initiatives like H2O Ohio. But despite the attention and funding, water quality in watersheds remains complex. There's a lot of agencies, data sets, monitoring efforts that are all operating in different silos. And this is where GeoConnects and the Internet of Water can help. It makes it easier to find, access, and connect all that data, starting with a shared backbone of identifiers and relationships. Next slide. This is a screenshot from GeoConnects Explorer. It's a new interface we have designed in partnership with the USGS. It's one way, not the only way, to explore what's available through GeoConnects. You can also access the data via something called an API, and you can use that to build your own kind of customized front end using the same open infrastructure. But what you see here is a linked view of all water data records associated with the Maumee River, from monitoring stations, municipal discharge data, to stream gauges and wells. Instead of hunting across who knows how many different portals, this tool lets users explore site types, the types of variables measured, and the spatial relationships all in one place. And behind the scenes, everything is tied together by persistent identifiers and linked metadata. This is what a connected, modern water data system looks like, and it's what allows communities, researchers, and agencies to move from fragmented data sets to coordinated insight and action. With that, I'll turn it back to Jeff to close.
Thanks, JP. The concept of a knowledge graph here is really what we are starting to look at data across systems. Really what we built in Pinal County on the back end is a knowledge graph as a way of being able to reference and connect data in a living way across a lot of different systems, a lot of different providers, and a lot of different contexts into a unified view of the world. WOA, or Who Owns America, what we often reference as WOA, and GeoConnects really we see as foundational building blocks for creating smarter land and water planning. Looking at structuring data to shift it from single-use data, as was mentioned, kind of was collected for a very specific purpose and specific format and a specific system, to making it more accessible across a variety of planning needs. This is going to require a shift in the way that people think about data in a lot of ways, particularly looking at it from the purpose of just having standardized way of referencing things. Oftentimes when data is collected, it's an open text box, as opposed to, even though there's only a finite number of selections that it could be. And that leads to a lot of error as people are entering things, even down to extra spaces or abbreviations, and creating more standardized fashion of how data is entered from just that drop down of those potential options can make it a lot more accessible into the future. As CGS is working on building out kind of these foundational technologies like GeoConnects and Who Owns America, we're really working with partners to think more about how they can streamline and standardize data on their side that can feed into it and connect to it, because every additional data set you bring in builds out the complexity and our nuance and understanding of what's going on across the land. CGS is really focused on building these tools, helping partners implement the technologies and systems as a backbone of interconnected data. We don't see it as we manage everything and we host everything and everyone has to go through us. What we're trying to do is build an open system where data just seamlessly talks to each other. It's a little bit complex, but this is kind of our vision of the future of how all of these things start to relate and how they start to interact with each other. As you can see, kind of the red circles are foundational data sets. The green circles are some products that we're working on, or solutions that we're working on. The blue text in the circles is really looking at all of the different things that we can address by having this information in a consolidated system. All of the black circles around it are where we're pulling data in and where we're serving data out to different partners. It's complex, but you start to see how you can have just this very, very comprehensive and built out understanding of the land that can help inform any variety of different planning tasks. At its core, it's just having data talk to each other in a really easy to use format. And once you start to build these systems and have things that allow information to flow seamlessly, you can really bring in a variety of different aspects to any challenge that you're having, bring in all of the nuance that you need to have, and really be able to inform better conversations about the future that you want to build. With that, I'm going to stop presenting, but we definitely have some time at the end. Would be happy to open up any questions and invite Marian and Christine to come back in at the end. If you're interested in hearing more about any of this, I'm going to put up our email addresses and our website and encourage you to visit, email, and we'd love to have any other questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. All right. So folks, again, if you have questions, just feel free to type those in the Q&A box and we will do our best to get to them.
Yep.
So first question is, for clarification, there are 7 active management areas in Arizona and the ADAWS rules were instituted through rulemaking, not legislation. Can you clarify that? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
I think some of those, there might have been a new AMA here recently, but I appreciate the clarification on that. Thank you.
Great. Next question. Is the parcel data, the 157 million
Yep.
property parcels across the nation, created at a fixed point in time? Do you update it? Do you update it when parcels get split into smaller property parcels? Like, how do you keep it current?
Yes,
How do you keep it
all of
moving?
those.
Right?
Yes to all of those.
Yeah.
So we do have as our baseline a fixed point of time, and that was generally about January 2025 was kind of our first big national run. We are updating it on a periodic timeline. We have our next update to run in September using data from kind of July, August timeframe. Our goal is to have it updated twice a year. A lot of it is trying to find that balance between how much has changed versus kind of the time and cost that it takes to update it and be able to have kind of all of those change products involved. With it, we are keeping track of things like subdivisions and hypothetically combinations of parcels as well, where we're keeping track both of who was the owner of that master parcel that was subdivided, as well as then what is the breakdown of those parcels down below. This is something that's a little bit different than a way that a lot of municipalities have been tracking things, where once a parcel is subdivided, you're tracking those subdivided parcels and not the parcel that was there before. And so from that perspective, it really is, we see as a benefit to be able to kind of track where are you seeing subdivisions? Was it going from, owner occupied family farms into 27, new townhouses, whatever it may be, but having a lot of that nuance to it.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Go ahead, JP.
I was just going to jump in. There was I tried
Please.
to put a link into one of the questions. It looks like it, so it shows up as answered, but there's a question, will you be able to determine whether the acres of public land suggested to be sold in the Senate's budget would really be useful for housing? So I posted a link to a blog. We actually did analysis for this under the previous administration's White House. And we looked at government ownership, throughout the country, and I think one of the key conclusions from that was there's much more opportunity at the state and local level to develop land. And I'll let Jeff talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Long story short is we found about 250,000 acres of government-owned land in transit-accessible urban areas. Only about 5% of that, if I'm remembering the statistic correctly, is federally owned land. About 75% of it is local-owned land. And so we had a lot of criteria around that of, it had to be at least a half acre. It had to have no buildings on it, or if it did have a building, it was less than 1,000 square foot footprint and less than 5% of the total parcel area. So it's not conversion of like a federal building, tearing it down and building housing. It's like empty parking lots, excess land, stuff like that. And it had to be in transit accessible urban areas, which was defined as at least one public transit stop per hour during rush hour and within about a 10-minute walk of that area. So we did look at it. Vast majority was local owned land in transit accessible urban areas. On the back end, we do technically have all of the other land that's government owned. But from our perspective, it was kind of, if you want to build housing where people want it, it's going to be transit accessible urban areas.
Yep.
Great.
And there's another question that was answered. Are all residents metered? How did you obtain information on unmetered or well water use? Just curious how that interplayed. So the Arizona Water Company provided the actual metered data. For the most part, residents were metered. There was also well use data. That was also, everything was coming from the utility itself, but that data was separated from what all the other partners were able to see. We stripped it of personally identifiable information and we aggregated it to like that neighborhood level. So it couldn't be directly traced to, my neighbor is using this much water, right? And so that was a key area of where we were able to build trust. We needed that as an input, but we also couldn't show that to everybody else. And it wasn't appropriate to share that level of information with others necessarily. And so that's one of the ways that we're able to set up permissions for different people to be able to work with each other.
Okay, thank you. Has the center worked on any projects related to agricultural land ownership as part of Who Owns America?
So ironically, we worked on the question before Who Owned America was a thing. We worked with the Public Policy Innovation Center out in California, looking at the Central Valley and looking at ownership trends of agricultural farms across the Central Valley, particularly with relationship to the potential that the State Groundwater Management Act changes to regulations would impact the amount that it could be withdrawn. How would that impact small versus large farms, different crop types, and as much as we could, the demographics of ownership in the area to say, is this hitting mostly small minority owned farm, or is it hitting some of the big producers of high value crops? And how do you kind of have a more equitable version of what implementation looks like? We have had interest as well looking at things in the Colorado River, and particularly looking at kind of the intersection of water rights and agriculture and ownership. But we haven't completed those projects yet.
Good question. Do you find any data gaps in rural areas and how do you deal with it?
Yes. So we are purchasing the Parcel data itself from a company called Regrid that's doing a lot of work on aggregating data from county sources into a standardized data schema in terms of ownership and all of that, and then doing a lot of cleaning and supplementation on top of that. I would say that there's definitely gaps in rural areas. Just a lot of it comes down to the capacity and the budgets of local planning offices. Oftentimes, higher income areas and more densely urban areas have larger planning departments. And with that comes dedicated staff focused on updating data on a more regular basis. And so there is a little bit of gap, both in terms of sometimes we usually have a pretty good parcel geometry, but ownership information can be either missing or out of date. Part of our process, we're actually working with another company called Atom, ATTOM, that does a lot of deed aggregation similar to Regrid's parcel information. And so part of our process is to look between those two data sets for every property and say, if we're missing an owner information, if we're missing any part of the address, does Atom have it in their deed information? And being able to kind of backfill and compare the two to say which one's most up to date. So anything that we're missing data or seems out of date, we're actually checking to backfill to have the most complete and up-to-date data set across that, which we have found pretty good. In some areas, though, we're updating 70% of parcels with some aspect, whether it's owner name, mailing address, completeness of that, to be able to have that kind of big analysis ready data set.
Marianne has a question. Would you like, please go ahead.
Sure. So Jeff, can you pull up the second to the last slide again?
Yes,
what does the future look like? Because I have a question for you about that slide.
Let's see. This one? You can't see it yet because I have to hit share.
This one? Okay. Yes. So all of the inputs, all those wonderful data sets, some of us wonder whether those data sets will continue to be kept up to date with budget cuts in Washington.
Yeah.
Can you comment about how you feel your input data might change over time, or whether
Yeah.
you're worried about some of these inputs?
Yeah, I mean it's a real challenge. I would say a lot of the data that is federal, do have longstanding benefits, and I think that we have already seen some, like certain climate data sets that were taken down and had an immediate reaction, particularly from the agricultural community, saying these data sets are critical for us making decisions long term. And so I think some like USGS gauge data, I think US Bureau of Reclamation reservoir data, I think National Weather Service data, we'll see kind of what comes out of that, particularly after the summer, have a lot of value to it, as well as USDA Data Gateway, particularly with the agriculture community. And I think those areas you have a little bit more long-term stability. I think where you have others that are probably a little bit more risk are things like EnviroAtlas, EJ Screen, climate data, climate.gov, that are a little bit more politically charged. That being said, we have also seen a really strong outpouring of support from the academic and NGO community, basically rebuilding these data sets and their methodologies after they've been taken down, where you're seeing it migrate a little bit from the public sector to the private sector, academic sector, maintaining those resources because they are so valuable. Long term, we'll have to see kind of how long NGOs and academic partners can keep things running and updated, even if they have the methodology, because that does cost money. But ideally, I think I'm hoping that enough people will speak out to the value of these data sets that they don't go away forever.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I have a couple of thoughts, Marianne. One is just the nature of knowledge graph technology is that you are linking different disparate data sets. And so if there's ones that we see that drop off for a variety of reasons, there's a variety of other, non-governmental data sets that exist out there that sometimes crop up in support of that, right? And so I think, for example, on the water side, OpenET, for instance, right? Not necessarily governmental, right? And what's important about this type of data infrastructure that we're showing here is that it's flexible, right? It's modular. You can connect to different data that is not all perfectly exactly the same way. That's an unreasonable expectation, even to think that everything will fit together super well. It's that we describe it well, and therefore we're able to digest and consume it and make use of it. And so I think what we're seeing is that, maybe the federal government's going to take a lesser role in the future, at least in the immediate future. But there's a whole data ecosystem that exists beyond them, even, that's incredibly important. And even if we weren't losing some of those data sets, there's still problems that exist of being able to link that type of information together. And this is really a solution to that challenge.
So while I have you on this political theme, I noticed you answered a question in the Q&A about whether you'd be able to determine the acres of public lands that are being suggested to be sold in the Senate's budget would be useful actually for housing. And I noticed you linked our president's message. And I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that for the group.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit a second ago. Mary, I might have missed that, but yes, you can do that. And I think that's the power of one of these knowledge graph approach. I'm going to stop sharing just so I can have people bigger on my screen. Looking at overlaying these data very quickly and easily. I've seen a number of partners do this recently as well, looking at everything from Esri's green infrastructure layer to be able to say, where do you have proposed lands from a green infrastructure perspective? But realistically, we can look at it, the same data, just from our transit accessible urban area kind of layer that we had already created. And the reality is a lot of lands not being proposed are in transit accessible urban areas. I think there are some, particularly around kind of Las Vegas area and Bureau of, blanking on the exact bureau. But looking at, there are some federal lands that are being proposed that may be of value to that, but I think the vast majority are in areas that would require significant amounts of infrastructure be run out to them, from water, from roads, from electric, from broadband, kind of all those other tasks, and don't necessarily have supporting infrastructure around them for schools, for, everything else. And so could they be turned into development? Yes. Would that have a large cost associated with them of providing infrastructure with them? Most likely also yes.
Yeah, no, I meant that
Yeah.
it just put into context the article that JP had linked.
I think it's like a little snapshot to give folks an idea is that analysis found that for every acre of developable federal land, and by that we mean not trying to do Burning Man in the middle of somewhere that's inaccessible and completely unreasonable to build housing, there's 52 acres of controlled state and local government land. And so the focus on federal lands is really, missing the big picture here, which is that's not really where the opportunity is. Setting politics aside, if we want to have more housing, and we can all agree on that, that's not where you're going to get the best bang for your buck. And so I think we could certainly look at what the Senate has proposed and get an idea on that. But I think that the findings would be similar. It's just that there's a whole area of opportunity, and we should be looking elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. I see, Christine, we have more questions.
Yep, we do. This next one is, how do you create parcel fabric from so many disparate data sources?
Yep.
My city spans 3 counties, still manually editing parcels to get them to fit together.
Yeah.
This is not an unusual story.
Yeah. Yeah, so we are leveraging Regrid's national parcel data from that. I don't think they're getting to the level of having kind of the topological perfection that many people would want to have at a local scale, where you have parcel boundaries perfectly lining up with each other. For the majority of our work, that's not necessarily as big of an issue of having a little bit of overlap, especially at the edges of the counties and stuff like that. So we haven't been working on that level of topological accuracy. We've been focusing more on the overall trends and ownership piece of it. It would require a much larger team if we were trying to do that across the entire country.
Okay, next question, and maybe you all remember talking about it and can reference it. The question is, do you have plans to expand this area? And I don't know what that's in reference to. Do either one of you know?
I'm assuming that is the Pinal project that I referenced.
Let's make assume.
Work with that assumption. The short answer is yes, we do. Both the current analysis does not cover the entire county. It covers part of the county, so that's one piece of it. The other is that there are other regions throughout the state and active management areas that we'd like to do this work with. We'd also like to get more water utilities involved with it beyond the ones that are currently part of this process.
Thank you.
I did see one of the questions was talking about EJ Screen being removed from the EPA's website.
Yeah.
That is true, but it has been recreated. That's kind of what I was referencing. If you go to screening-tools.com, there's a group called the Public Environmental Data Partners. It's a group of NGOs and academic partners who are basically taking all of the original source code, all of the original data, and standing these tools back up so that they're still accessible, but not necessarily controlled by the federal government. And so it is true that it was taken down, but it is not gone. It is just moved.
Okay. Cleaning up data is a big issue. Do you have recommendations about how future or new data is obtained or upgraded? We're just going to keep talking about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, we have a lot of thoughts.
Right.
So there's a lot that can be done in terms of the way that data is entered. Oftentimes, you have the way that databases are set up, you can have things where you have a domain for a question, and that basically says, here's the list of acceptable answers for this question. And so things like zoning, things like, acres, whatever, you can set up domains within your databases that basically say it has to be one of these 7 land use types or 10 land use types or whatever you have. And as opposed to open text boxes. As good as we want to be typing or copying and pasting information, there's always mistakes. There's like extra spaces, there's extra periods, there's extra whatever. Having pre-formatted options for your answers can cut way down on that ability to be able to look at that. I think another one is just standards for how you reference common abbreviations, and just sticking to them and holding data accountable to that, and periodically going through and reviewing and being able to say, we are always going to spell out address suffix, street, avenue, road, whatever it is. And that I live in Cape St. Clair, and the ST always, like if you ask Alexa, it's like Cape Street Clair, because ST it thinks it's street. And so having just a consistent format of how you write things and sticking with that can also have a really big impact on data cleaning and data use later on, because you don't have 6 different versions of the same words. I mean, we have a running list of how many different ways United States of America is spelled across parcel data. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, common state departments and stuff like that, you have literally 26 different ways that the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, MBTA, is spelled, because it's just different abbreviations, different words are abbreviated. Some is just M space B space T A space A versus MBTA versus MBT Authority versus whatever it is. It's just pick one and stick with it. Is the core of it. Oftentimes it's hard because these are legacy systems that have been built and populated over the last 30 or 40 years, and issues have compounded over time. And you're asking staff that are already overburdened and under budget to be able to go back, but periodically going through and taking that step back and saying, like, we are going to go through the database and we're going to apply these rules, and we're going to get a starting point now going forward of having everything in a standardized fashion, at least to get up to date, and then ideally putting in place some of these other rules to be able to standardize data collection going forward, can make a really big impact.
I'm going to jump in with a couple of my thoughts too on this. At kind of the meta level, I think more when you think about your own data sets, maybe you produce them, maybe you maintain them, maybe you update them, maybe you're just referencing them. But if you're on the kind of data creation, data publishing side, something that's really important to keep in mind is the idea of eliminating single-use data. There might be uses for your data that you cannot even think of today that in the future will be very, very important. And so instead of using a Keurig cup that we use and discard once, we want to make sure that data is reusable. There's just an enormous network effect to this. It's a huge effort, but I think that's when I talk about future new data, that's something that comes to mind. In terms of more specifics on it, I think persistent unique identifiers are really key. That helps for kind of that knowledge graph approach that we've talked about, and for modernizing data. So that's a huge one. There's also, following standards for metadata and formatting is also really helpful, because the future is really machine readable data. It's less about us. It's more about making this data and information available for machines to and I think that if these words scare you, if this sounds daunting, that's why we exist, right? It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to be crazy. This is occurring across tons of domains right now at this very moment. And so we're the type of people who can help you with this.
Speaking of automation,
Mm-hmm.
what tools do you use for automating your analysis? And can we also talk about money and kind of the cost of these things, and where all the magic grant money is for it? And also to that, then let's talk free sources like open source libraries. And also, this is like 12 questions in one, I guess, but also then, how much can you trust open source libraries? So all the things.
So all the things. For Who Owns America, I'll talk about that first. That is built on a open source Python conglomeration of tools. So right now it is all Python based, but it is all open source based. Originally, it was ArcPy based. Just when I first wrote it, that's what I was most familiar with. But now my incredible data team, who's much smarter, has migrated it all to open source. And with that, we've seen dramatic performance improvements as well. most of the data is in GeoParquet format, if that is something that you're familiar with or doesn't scare you. And with that, again, kind of those data format can have a really big impact on efficiency of processing and how data is accessed. The majority of funding for building out Who Owns America was internal to the Lincoln Institute. We just saw this as such a foundational data set for so much of Lincoln's work, and to be able to answer questions and policy questions across Lincoln's work, that Lincoln's leadership made the decision to invest in building this out. Our model going forward, updating it, is some continued support from Lincoln, but we also work with local partners, both from like a data purchase perspective to help underwrite it. A lot of it is also working with them on visualization tools or other aspects, kind of on a fee-for-service model, to be able to get them access to the information, but really in a way that integrates with the planning work that they're doing to be able to help inform those questions.
And what I'll say is, a lot of times when we work with partners, we meet them wherever they are. If it makes the most sense to be working in the Esri ecosystem, across that, we're fluent and well-versed, and that makes sense. Not everybody wants to work in that. Not everything should be in the Esri ecosystem. And so in those cases, a lot of times the open source world makes a lot of sense, can make certain things actually easier. I'd say that we're big supporters of open source generally, and some of the developers we have here are key contributors to a number of key packages across the open source world.
And the only reason why I really know anything about open source is because of the APA Technology Division, and they host a ton of sessions about just that thing.
Yeah.
So for those friends that haven't invested time in those webinars, can you speak briefly about essentially what open source data is?
Yeah, so open source data, I mean, there's two things. One is open source software, the other is open data. And those are two very similarly worded things. Open source software is software that is built out of the goodness of people's hearts, for lack of a better term, but provided with an open license. So anyone can take it, download it, incorporate it in their processing, be able to build on top of it, et cetera. Oftentimes it has a share-alike condition to it. So if you are getting a package from somebody, you need to put your package back out in a share-alike, license with it. Open data is a concept really looking at it from the perspective. A lot of what we talked about is making data that is accessible to anybody, and making it is data that someone can download, can interact with, doesn't have cost associated with it, et cetera. I think with both of them, and you kind of got this, your last question, can you trust it? It's like anything. It's like any news that you get on the internet. You have to do a little bit of digging to say, is this a trusted source? Is this someone who is acting out of goodwill? Be able to put your own lens of reality on it and be able to say, does this look right? That gut check to just say, does this appear to be a accurate representation of the world and what I'm working from that? Increasingly, what we're seeing is a lot of federal government, state government, local governments making their data available through open data hubs, where you can go, you can easily access it in a variety of formats to be able to incorporate it in any sort of work that you're doing. And so overall, yes, I think you can trust it, but like anything, use your best interest and guts to kind of vet what you're getting it from, and not just find some random link online and say, yes, this is of course reality.
Any final thoughts as we're wrapping up here?
Very much appreciate the time. I think what JP said, it's one of the biggest messages that we're screaming from the rooftops is, let's move away from single serve data and really look at how we can start to incorporate data for a variety of purposes. It requires some intentional work up front to be able to do it, but I think the dividends long term are just going to be able to make everything a lot better.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the pace of the world, the pace of technology right now can be daunting. And what I want to leave people with is that that's why we exist. We're here to help navigate that. You might not have time, understandably, because of all the different commitments you have, to be up to date on all the technology changes that are occurring in the world. AI is in the news every single day, right? And separating fact from fiction, if you don't live in that world, can be tough. That's part of what we can do.
And my final word is join
Please.
us in the Water and Planning Network if you're so inclined. Just send an email to water@planning.org. And thank you,
And Marianne,
Christine.
I don't know if you saw it. I put a
Yes,
whole bunch of links in the
you
chat
did.
for
I
folks
did
that
see
are
it. Thank
interested
you.
in all the things. So
Thank you very
great.
much.
Okay, so thank you to the Water and Planning Network and to the APA ENRI division, and of course our friends at the Lincoln Institute. Thank you, Jeff and John Paul, and this was great discussion. I loved it. I learned a lot, and I loved all of the questions. So thanks, folks, for engaging. Don't forget to log your CM credits. I'll have this session recording up on our YouTube channel probably on Monday. YouTube.com/planning webcast, and you can register for all of our upcoming sessions, get all the information you need about anything at ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So thanks again to everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.